We're very pleased tonight to have Monika Ferenczy with us today. She's an expert in academic matters, assessments, IEPs, IPRCs. And this is a topic that we haven't covered in the past. I would think that the reason that we have the 196 rather than 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, as we often would, is that it primarily appeals, I presume, to families who have kids that are of school age, which is, a proportion, a subset of all the families in the province that have kids with special needs. Monika, would you like to say any further words of introduction for yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Ken. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation for being invited on the webinar tonight. I have done some radio interviews and some television spots, but I've never done a webinar before, so this is a first for me. And I have a great deal of information, but I have tried to put it in as concise form as possible for tonight's presentation because there is a lot of information, and most parents, when their children start at the beginning of the education sector in junior kindergarten, senior kindergarten, are quite overwhelmed with the process. So we'll try to keep it very simple and concise tonight, but of course feel free to contact me for more information and specifics as it pertains to your child, because every case is unique as to how we help a family with a child with special needs in the education sector. So mostly what I'm going to be speaking about tonight is the public education sector. I can touch on private schools as well, but there are very few of them that cater to special needs children and youth. My background is an special education consultant with the school board, formerly here in Ottawa. I have been in the education sector for over 25 years and have traveled from the Toronto GTA area down to southwestern Ontario and London, where I spent 15 years, and then the past 11 years here in Ottawa. And the reason I started this practice is because I felt a little frustrated that there were wonderful ideas and things and strategies that could be put in place, but I wasn't able to effectuate those in the public education system. And so 8 years ago, I took my practice into the private sector, and I have been an education consultant helping families to navigate the education system. And I have had more and more parents contact me. And I have also formed a practice network where I work with neuro-optometrists and audiologists specializing in central auditory processing, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, psychologists. And so I was very pleased to hear about the services that Ken offered, because I didn't actually have anyone in my practice network that could help families with that piece of information, which is critical. And that is information that I ask them at my intake process, but that I really require someone with expertise in that area to carry through and carry those families forward on that piece. So I'm very pleased to have made my acquaintance with Ken, and hopefully tonight's presentation will address a bit of both issues, and of course we're both available to expand on those should you have any questions. And so tonight I'm going to focus on mostly communication and assessments and the type of supports that one can expect in the system regardless of the age of the child or youth, because we're speaking up to the age of 21. Children with special needs can stay in the system until the age of 21. So the first contact point is junior kindergarten at age 4 or 5. Some families choose to hold the child out of school, especially if they have a developmental delay, because they will be in a class of 30, potentially 30 children, whereas in a grade 1 setting, they would be in a class of 20. So sometimes that's a family choice as to when the child enters the school system, but there's lots of information to know to ramp up and get educated about the education system. So the first really important piece is communication. And communication with school personnel, this involves emails and letters, which are preferable to phone calls, only because it provides some tracking and documentation for you to reference, as there will be many going forward. And having the ability to copy several individuals versus one contact person on the phone. it makes for very efficient communication, because one of the issues that we now face in the system is very high turnover. So parents express frustration to me that they tell everything that they need to tell to the classroom teacher at the beginning of the year, and then the principal and all the support individuals, and then there's a maternity leave, there's a sick leave, and there's a change in principals, and there's having to start all over. And so I help put that information into very concise bits for school staff so that they are able to act on it and not become overwhelmed as well with the demands made by parents having a child with special needs. So the first point of contact is the classroom teacher, and I am so glad that unfortunately, this is a positive effect of the COVID virus, but that teachers are now engaging in email communication with students and parents and principals likewise, because that was a very hard sticking point until now. Many school boards and school unions indicate to their teachers not to communicate with parents by email. And this was a very big challenge that we've had until now. And I'm hoping after this time that this will become a lot easier. Generally, early childhood educators and educational assistants are not allowed to communicate with parents, but you can communicate with them in person. When you go to pick up your child, you can receive feedback from them, and they are the ones who will work most with the youngest children. However, we do have educational assistants who work with high school students as well. And so that person may be a constant throughout your child's journey in the system. However, it will not be the same individual. The learning support teacher, or resource teacher as they're called in some school boards, is the person who is responsible for putting the individual education plan, or IEP, in place, and the principal is the one who supervises it. Principal and vice principal have the same roles in education, so they can delegate tasks that they do to a vice principal up to a certain point. The two most important pieces of policy that I always mention to parents are the 2017 Special Education Ontario Kindergarten to Grade 12 Policy and Guideline from the Ministry of Education, and the 2018 Ontario Human Rights Commission Policy, Accessible Education for Students with Disabilities. This one is very important because it arose out of the challenges and obstacles that parents were facing with meeting the needs of their children in the system. So very pleased to see that policy come out, and those are the two that we lean on when we speak and we advocate for children in the system. I can go to the next slide.
Okay, and I'd like to point out for people, there's now 58 people taking part, that there is a question box at the bottom of the screen that you may not have noticed, and you can either ask a question and have your name shown or make it anonymous. We have one question. It's a question that's not related to this topic. But right about now, people discover the question box and start to send questions in. How's this? You on this page?
Yep, this is good. So AODA, or the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, is the one that also has a cross-section with the Education Act, because education is a service in Ontario. And under the Ontario Human Rights Code, education is also a service. So when students are not being supported, that is indicative of a level of support. So when we talk about barriers or obstacles, a barrier is a circumstance that can keep people apart. For people with disabilities, barriers can be attitudinal, communication, physical, policy, programmatic, social, and transportation. The ones that we come across most often in the education system with parents is the attitudinal one, the communication one, and sometimes the transportation. And so the reason we come across those is because I don't feel at this time that school boards do enough training in AODA compliance. And so sometimes what is said to a parent, what is implied, what is manifested is actually a human rights violation, although it's unconscious, but it still needs to be corrected. And so many of the times when I assist parents in meetings, we need to bring up AODA and what it means. And we find for the most part that information and knowledge about it is lacking. So even though school board employers must train educators, there are only 4 PD days in a year, and 2 of them are ministry directed. So I'm not sure whether AODA falls under one of those ministry directed PD days in a school year, but I do know that very little time is spent addressing this important background information for educators.
There's one question, will the PowerPoint be available afterwards? And yes, everyone who's registered will receive the link, the PowerPoint slides and the link to the recorded YouTube video. Next slide.
Yes.
There we go.
So how to effectively advocate for your child in the school. This is a challenge because sometimes the information flows only one way, and that's the parent to the school. And the most common complaint and frustration, again, that I receive from my clients is that they have no idea what the child is doing in school. They don't receive information about an incident or an event that's happened, whether in the classroom or on the schoolyard. Very little documentation is done. So it really puts a great onus on the parent to stay informed. And so the Ministry of Education website is fluid, although not too fluid, with the exception of these days. So the best avenue is to communicate with school staff. Reviewing your child's Ontario school record, or the OSR file, that's the legal file that is in every school, public school in Ontario, public, Catholic, English, French, and it has all of the information that pertains to your child. And the reason this needs to be reviewed every year, usually at the IPRC meeting, which happens annually, is that sometimes information that parents provide does not make it into the file. And that leads to a lack of understanding as to why a child is not getting additional support, or requests for referrals have not been put in. And so I recently had this incident with a client who moved to Ontario in 2016, provided all of the reports of her 3 special needs children to the school, and we've only just discovered now, 4 years later, that that information never made it into the file. And so her children did not have access to the right amount of support. In fact, a special education class, system class, which they had had in another province and in the US, as it was a family who had moved around. So it's critical that whatever you send in to the school, you always put OSR copy in the top right-hand corner, and that will ensure that it makes it into the file.
Monika, there's a question from Aaron.
Yes.
I've been told EAs can no longer write in my child's agenda or communicate with me. They spend all day with my child. Why would they not be a source of information? Good question.
Yes, so EAs, that would be something that would need to be addressed with the school principal, because you have a right to information from anyone who works with your child in the education system. So whether it's a lunchroom supervisor, a co-op student, a parent volunteer, anyone should be able to write into the agenda. However, I am going to say that those agendas are not reliable sources of information anymore, and I am encouraging that my clients move to email communication, because it's trackable. The problem is those agenda books many times go missing. They just disappear. So I also encourage that those communication books be photocopied once a week by parents and kept at home, because sometimes when a thorny issue arises and there was a note, like I said, the communication book suddenly disappears. And so the EA, but there's many ways that an EA can communicate with parents. They are not the first link of communication, so that's probably why that question is arising, because the classroom teacher has the authority to communicate with parents with input from the EA. However, because the EA is the one spending the most amount of time with the child, most teachers prefer that the EA write the comments in the communication book. However, this would be a protocol that we would sit down and work out with the school principal.
She says it's the principal who told her this and seemed to indicate that it had to do with unions.
Yes, so that is part of the problem that I indicated when I began, which is that unions have directed their members not to speak to parents in email or not to speak to them at all.
Awesome.
However, this is in conflict because it's in conflict with the Ontario Public Service Standards, because education is a service, and the public has a right to communicate via phone, email, fax, or social media with school providers. So this is an element that I'm hoping will be resolved as a part of this COVID-19 situation, because it is a best practice, and there is, like I said, it's part of the public service standards. So the reason that unions tell their members not to communicate with parents is because of the fear of litigation in case they say or do something or write something that will come back to them. And that's the reason behind it. However, it impedes the communication dialogue between parents and students, which is critical to know, to be informed as a parent.
Makes sense.
The rest of these items are pretty self-explanatory. I've had also school boards at meetings indicate that they do not consent to the meeting being recorded. However, a parent has the right to record a meeting in which they participate for personal purposes. Sometimes parents are the ones with special needs as well, and so recording a meeting helps them retain the information that was discussed. So they cannot be prevented from recording, but it is a courtesy to say that they are recording the meeting. I have had instances where the meeting was canceled on the spot when a parent wanted to record the meeting. So that, again, these are communication protocols that need to be clarified with, at that level, if the messaging is coming from the principal, it has to be addressed to the superintendency of the school board. So special system class placements. So for our students with special needs, and this is regardless of the level again, regardless of the grade level, but very relevant to the level of functioning of the child or the teen. There are 3 general placements in the public education system. One is fully integrated in a regular classroom. And so some school boards have this model, that's their service model, so they don't have any special classes unless the child has very, very high needs. So they will attend the regular classroom with other children, and this is generally fine until the end of primary, grade 3. It becomes a little more difficult in grade 4, 5, and 6, 7, and 8, because clearly the students with some developmental challenges and learning challenges fall very quickly behind their peers, and some may notice that they are not functioning to the same level as their peers and become victims of bullying. So full integration is a really nice theory, but in practice it often leads to bullying. So it's a decision that a parent needs to make depending on what is offered at the school board level. So a semi-integrated model is where students will spend, for example, the morning learning at their own rhythm and pace in a special education class, which has a lower teacher ratio, maybe 8 to 10 students. And then in the afternoon, they'll integrate into art or phys ed, or at the high school level, it could be the workshop or some co-op or some other types of activities within the school. And then the highest level of support is the self-contained system class. So for example, autism classes, learning disability, language. There used to be what was called a behavior class as well. And behavior, unfortunately, is still an official placement and identification in the Ministry of Education definitions, which is going to come under the microscope very soon, because behavior for students with special needs is most often a function of the disability. And so it is in conflict with the Ontario Human Rights Code to have a behavioral identification. And so most of the identifications should be based on the DSM codes. which are the statistical manual that psychologists and physicians use to identify a disability, a disorder, a condition. And so behavior in itself is unless it's ODD, which is oppositional defiant disorder, is a behavioral identification and diagnosis. But we very much try to stay away from that because there's usually other factors involved and other identifications that don't negatively impact a child, such as a behavior identification. Initially, when I started my practice, many of the students with autism were in a behavioral identification, and we switched them to autism. That's one of the positive changes that has happened in the ministry definitions, because autism is under a communication disability where it should be. And so school boards need to support the needs of students. I will often be told by parents that they are told that when they give a professional assessment that the recommendations are just recommendations and that they don't need to be followed by the school personnel. But this isn't exactly true, because the school board has to accommodate a child to the point of undue hardship, which is a statement that comes from AODA. And so the level of service, which is not written down and is fluid, is sometimes what needs to be negotiated between the family and the school board. And this happens at the superintendent level, the school board level, even if the child is in a regular classroom. And this is where collaboratively working with the school principal and superintendent of special education can bring positive changes about and helping students get into those system classes. The other challenge we've had is that with the rise of autism diagnosis, the school board will say, well, all of our autism classes are full. There's a wait list. But under the Ontario Human Rights Code, technically new autism classes should be opened. And so I know some school boards work very diligently in doing that as much as possible, whereas others will just refer their students to the coterminous school board for that level of service, which isn't exactly the right thing, but it's part of the reality. Transportation, I just want to touch on transportation because it does fall under AODA, and safety issues and specialized transportation is something that students have a right to. So if your special needs child cannot ride a regular school bus to school because of sensory processing overload, it's awful noisy places, or the school bus is too long of a ride, you can request specialized individual special transportation. And that's where a child will be picked up by a van where only the child and maybe one other child, or sometimes completely individualized transportation can be arranged. However, that's a more complicated process, and that occurs again at the superintendent level because it's a special request. But you do have the right to have specialized transportation. Other safety issues include proper harnesses. We've had drivers who have put children into the back seat with the lap belt instead of a car seat. Those are special transportation issues that relate to special needs children. So very, very important when it comes to their safety. So I just want to touch on EAs because many parents will say, well, I want an EA to support my child one-on-one in the classroom. Unfortunately, one-on-one support does not exist anymore. It did in the past, and that was at a time when school boards were funded by the individual child, and now they are funded for special education in an envelope. So the total amount of special needs children per school board, which is divided then and staffing is allocated according to that. So all EAs are considered shared support unless there is a medical need. So a medical EA will support a child coming back from surgery in the school, one that has elopement issues, so a child who runs away from the classroom, safety issues. So generally safety medical issues or behavioral challenges, but I like to call them dysregulation because behavior always has a source. In young children, behavior is communication. So if you're having escalation in behavior, that means that there is a situation that the child is trying to manage, but cannot cope with. And so the adults have to figure out what that piece is. The last piece I wanted to mention is about assessments. So many people are told that, well, in order for your child to have an individual education plan, we need an assessment. That's not true. An IEP is put in place for any child that demonstrates a need. All of the language in the Ministry of Education policies and guidelines speak to needs. They don't speak to diagnosis. And yet, despite that, we will have even school board superintendents say, well, we need a diagnosis in order to be able to do that. And that, again, doesn't align with the Ontario Human Rights Code, because not everything can be diagnosed. But where there is a demonstrated need, that need needs to be accommodated. So assessments are important pieces when you want to have your child in a self-contained system class, because they do need a diagnosis of autism for an autism class. They do need a diagnosis of learning disability for an LD class, or a speech language class, for language for the younger children. So the types of assessments that can be done by parents that don't require any medical referral are hearing and vision, and I strongly recommend parents to do those first. And I am quite amazed at how many parents don't do the yearly vision check, which is free until the age of 21 for children. And then the hearing needs to be checked before they enter school, but also once every 2 or 3 years, because if there's a developmental disability in this child's profile, more than likely the sensory processing systems are also impacted. So the auditory and visual systems will have delays as well.
That's very interesting.
And so the assessments that I do are strictly academic, although I do work with psychologists to put together psychoeducational assessments, and that would consist of me doing the educational part, and that's usually the WIAT, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. I do the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test for the young children, because receptive and expressive language is a very good indicator of their school readiness skills and whether they'll have challenges in the classroom before they are able to be fully assessed. And sometimes, and this is where I have a little bit of a disagreement with some psychologists who will assess children as young as grade 2 or grade 1 or kindergarten even, and that's just not fair to the child, because they need to have been in the school system for at least 2 or 3 years, 4 years, before they are given an assessment. They need to have had enough opportunity and exposure to learning in a classroom before that's assessed. And sometimes that's 5 years. So grade 1, 2, and 3, junior, senior kindergarten. So generally, the first assessment for a learning disability will happen at the end of grade 3. But there are other assessments that can be done to check what's impacting the learning of the child, such as an occupational therapy assessment that looks at all the environmental stimuli, and schools are full of them, that may be interfering with a child's ability to learn. When kids get into high school and they start co-op and volunteer hours, an occupational health and safety assessment helps to identify what kind of work environments they should avoid, or that would align with their profile, so that those experiences are positive as well. So when you're prioritizing your child's needs to available programs in the school board, these are some of the considerations. Does your child have a static diagnosis? For example, autism is a static diagnosis, but it manifests itself differently as the child matures. So a teen with autism or a girl with autism will look very different than a younger child with autism. So the diagnosis is the same, but sometimes there's a change in diagnosis. Many of the mental health diagnoses are not diagnosed or cannot be diagnosed until the adolescent years. So sometimes a child can start out with one diagnosis, but in their teen years, there's other diagnoses that are added. And sometimes you may hear that the expression dual diagnosis or multiple diagnosis. And so for those children, we have to ensure that all of those diagnoses and their related needs are captured in the learning environment. So you need to consider the growth and development of the child. if they develop more slowly, for example, and this is where putting the child in the chronological age, which is not a ministry policy, and this happened to one of my clients coming from overseas. All three of her children were born late in the year. They were all placed in their chronological age year, and they ended up missing a full year of schooling because of it. So school boards have this wonky way of determining where to place a child, because they will not advance a gifted child to have them skip a year ahead, but they will assign a grade to a child coming in from another province or country and make them miss an entire year of schooling. So this is very discontinuous and disruption in the learning pathway of a child has significant impact when they get to high school and when they have to learn everything in 20 weeks in the semester system. So the growth and development of the child needs to be considered. Their level of independence versus level of support. So if your child needs a high level of support, a self-contained special system class is definitely for them. If independence is a goal for your child, then a regular classroom is definitely the place they should be. Learning priorities versus social integration needs. So many parents will say, well, the school board's mandate is to educate my child, so I want to make sure that they're learning this and this and this and this. Unfortunately, it's too overwhelming for classroom teachers to be able to do everything. So I often advise parents to pick the priority that's most important to them. Learning can be done outside of school. Parents are the child's first teachers. Learning can be done at home. It can be done in summer camp, and learning can be caught up. But social integration needs cannot. So once there's a delay in social integration needs, in the social interactions of a child or a youth, they tend to fall even further and further behind. So sometimes the parent will say, well, I want my child to go to school so that they learn those social integration skills more than the learning, and I'll take care of the learning, or put them with a tutor, for example, to make sure that the learning gets done. And focus on the social integration. And other parents pick the other way around for their priorities and say, I'll do the social integration through extracurricular activities. I want them to focus on learning. This particularly is important in the special education classes because some of them, like the developmental disabilities classes, they don't focus on academics. They focus on functional literacy and numeracy, which lead to non-credit courses at high school. And so I really strongly recommend parents not to consider those classes if they would like their children to gain a high school diploma, because those are what we call dead-end classes. They don't lead to credits, they don't lead to diplomas, and their children are basically babysat, and I say that in air quotes because I know that there are many, many very great teachers in those special education classes, but academics is not the first goal in those classes. So that's something to consider as well. Transportation location of programs. So you may be admissible to a program, but it may be a 40-minute drive away with the special education transportation. So if your child dysregulates very easily, has rough mornings, that's, it might be a great program, but if it's not in the local school, then it's not worth considering it because your child is going to be tired by the time they start their day. And school personnel, professional practitioners' recommendations. So often psychologists will make recommendations in their psychoeducational reports, which cannot be effectuated in the classroom. Psychologists, unfortunately, unless they're educational psychologists, are not familiar with the learning environment of the classroom and the way that children learn with all the technology. So sometimes those recommendations just won't work. And so they need to be sort of adapted to accommodations in the IEP, for example, or other modifications. And that's one of the ways that I help parents in translating the professional language into the educational lingo and making it possible for parents to have that in the school. And then the training of school personnel, again, you can have some wonderfully trained and enthusiastic teachers, but you may not get the results that you anticipate. So transitioning to community programs after age 21, this needs to start when they turn 16. And Any diagnosis needs to be updated. And sometimes they'll say, well, they've had this diagnosis since the age of 4. We don't think it needs to be updated. Nothing's going to change. And that may be true, but a newer diagnosis done with adult diagnostic tools, because as children age, the diagnostic tools change. Psychologists use different tools for different age levels. So when they turn 16, between 16 and 20, they need to be diagnosed with the adult tools, because that's the information that will be considered for things like passport funding, for community-based programs, for colleges and universities. They always request an assessment done in the last 2 years before the student starts in post-secondary. So that is very important. And so accommodations at college and university sometimes are better than those offered in the high school, but sometimes they're not. And sometimes if they're not articulated in an assessment report, they're not offered them. So again, it comes back to that Ontario Human Rights Code, where if the student says, well, I need this, and the institution says, well, sorry, it's not in your psych report, we don't have to offer you that accommodation, or it's not on our drop-down menu list, that needs to be discussed with a manager. And sometimes with some of my post-secondary clients, we've gone to the dean and we've gone to their accessibility services. Unfortunately, not many people are trained in accessibility programs and policies at the post-secondary level. And that's simply because there aren't any institution that offer this certificate or diploma training right now in Ontario. So we kind of have a catch-22 situation where the post-secondary institutions were told by the Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities that you need to offer more, first of all, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, more entry to special needs students to your programs. And secondly, your funding will only come if you offer a student success center where you help students with disabilities. But unfortunately, from my experience and some of my adult clients who've come to see me, those services are very meager, and the knowledge level of the staff is not what needs to be in order to meet the needs of the particular student. For example, I had a client who was a music major, and the accommodations that she needed were to have, she was a singer, so she needed an accompanist. And if this accompanist was not available, she needed to have an accommodation of time to find a new accompanist who could learn her repertoire and attend with her on her examination date. And so this particular student was not provided that extra time and did not do well on her examination and was not allowed to pursue her program in the 4th year at a university offering this program. And so ultimately it ended up going to the Human Rights Tribunal because it violated their own institution's policy on accessibility, because they just hadn't thought of the practical applications of an accommodation for a student in a music program versus a student writing theoretical or academic science programs, for example. So the accommodations have to fit the needs of the student, and they need to take into account what the student expresses as a need. And transition planning is very important, working on skills and financial planning, independent skills for our youth, because after age 21, there are more and more programs being offered by the community colleges, which is great. They are not degree or diploma granting programs, but the students are allowed to attend and audit those programs. My son was taking a program in furniture technician, and he had a student who was on the autism spectrum in his class who attended and learned skills, but it wasn't for the purpose of granting him a diploma or certificate the same way as the other students were in the class. But learning experiences and opportunities need to be continued to be offered to our young adults, and work placement programs that are available through the community agencies are wonderful in developing these independent skills. And so what to do when a problem occurs? Well, that would be to refer back to the documentation, the note-taking, referring to legislation, school board policy, and Ministry of Education memorandums. This is sometimes overwhelming for parents. So depending on the the level of comfort of a parent, I assist in this piece. And however, many of my clients work for government and are well versed in policy, and so they take the lead on with the right information. And always bringing a concern forward in the W5 format, keeping it simple. Superintendent likes to read the problem quickly and ascertain what the next step should be. Sometimes parents engage in long 2- and 3-page emails that are just telling the story, and the importance of the intervention that's being asked is somewhere lost in that correspondence. So keeping it very close and concise, and requesting what you're requesting to be in very clear language is also very helpful. And then if you have to go up the hierarchy to the superintendent, I would suggest you contact me, because superintendents sometimes are wonderful people, sometimes they're more gatekeeping, and they do defend their staff, their principal. That's what their role is as well. So many parents are surprised to find out that the superintendents don't advocate for their child, but that's not their mandate. So they will advocate for their staff. But at the same time, they are also public service providers and public servants in that sense. So they need to acknowledge the complaints and work with the parent to figure out a solution. And then when you've exhausted all of the internal school board processes for complaints and you still haven't resolved an issue, then you go to outside complaint mechanisms such as the Ontario Ombudsman's Office. They may do an intervention for you. They don't necessarily solve the issue. As I mentioned before, sometimes taking something to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal will get the attention that it needs on it. Sometimes it can be settled. Sometimes it is pursued. Small Claims Court has become a new venue for some of these issues, but like I said, it's much better to solve it collaboratively with staff, and that's where I'm hoping to assist parents. So that's it for my part, and I see Ken's slide up, so on to you.
Very good rock bottom advice based upon real experiences. I just want to provide a little bit of information. As the child is approaching 18, in most cases you'll want to apply for ODSP, and once they're successful, they'll get $11.69 a month or $8.96. They'll typically, if they're at home, which they will be, they'll be slotted into room and board, which is $8.96. And I think the next slide indicates that. Yep. So you can see that there's supports available, and the most common category here is a single individual. And you can see here that when the child's at home, they're typically slotted into $8.96. Now this helps, you know, when the child turns 18, they can still be in school, or they can still work and receive these amounts of money. And what this does is it gives some kind of handle on the number of people who have children with disabilities or special needs. You'll see that if you add all these up, that as of 2017, that there were 362,000 people aged 18 to 65 on ODSP. And our simple calculation is that since this is 18 to 65, it doesn't include the kids under 18, and it doesn't include the seniors over 65. So we calculate that to be about another third, roughly. Let's say another 100, 120,000. And if you were to say that half of those were children, then you're looking at approximately 60,000 children who, when they reach 18, will stand to receive provincial disability benefits. Now, of course, there's lots of children who have issues in the school system who won't be on ODSP, but this is a big factor in my practice. This is my main concern. And what you'll see here is that if you take the population of the province and you divide it by 3, which is what StatsCan says you do to calculate the number of households, because this is really what you deal with. You deal with a household. which happens to have a child with special needs. You can see that there's approximately 4.5 million of these households. And if you grossed up this number by 100,000, say, 462, let's just go with that, it means that one household in 10 is the parent household of a child with special needs. And this doesn't include all the kids that have learning issues that don't relate to eventually not being able to function in the workplace or manage their own care. It's a mind-boggling number when you stop and think about it. 1 in 10. Now, for passport funding, what happens in my clients' experience is that as they're approaching age 18, if they have cognitive impairments, and you can see that there was a fine distinction that Monika pointed out to me in an email earlier, that you can have cognitive impairments and you can have developmental disabilities. If you want to weigh in on this, Monika, feel free. But it is true that I've had clients whose children have autism, but they don't meet the criteria for Developmental Services Ontario. And if you do, no, back one. If you do meet the criteria for Developmental Services Ontario, then it simplifies the ODSP application process, because if you have that letter from DSO that you're on their list, then that means that the child is medically approved for ODSP. You don't have to fill out have the doctor fill out the package, the DAU package, and submit it and wait for approval and perhaps not succeed and so on. So, and as well, what they'll do is DSO will help you apply for passport funding. And what this is, it's like special services at home for when you're under 18. And it reimburses the parents for money that they laid out for programs for the child. 5,000 per child per year is a common kind of number. Another common experience is that the year that you apply, there's no money. And then you apply again the next year, still no money in the bucket. And then the third year, there is money in the bucket, and you receive something like, say, $5,000. There are cases of adult children, having more substantial funding, quite substantial. I've seen some very substantial situations, but 5 or 6 or 7,000 is a common kind of number. And what happens is, of course, once the child turns 18 and leaves high school, or even if they can stay until they're 21, what about the post-21 problem? Then now what do? Child can't stay home and watch TV for the rest of his life. So you have to come up with programs. One hopes that they've learned enough life skills to be able to be more independent. Lots of times, of course, as far as shopping and cooking, the child could do that, perhaps with some supports, but in practice, of course, what happens is, mom and dad do the shopping and cooking and make the food, and when we do the benefit increases from 896 to 1169, one of the issues we deal with and address is, can this child shop and cook? Because if they can, then we can not easily, but we can break them out from the room and board situation where they're being provided with a room plus food to a shelter plus supplementary arrangement where they actually pay shelter costs to their parents and have some capabilities to shop and cook, which is important. And that in conjunction with passport funding goes a certain distance. Of course, it's wonderful if a child can work. And of course, they can work on ODSP. It does have some impact, of course, on the benefits they receive, but work is good. Work is socialization. My experience is the kids work their asses off. They're good at getting there on time, and granted, there's lots of cases where the parents get them there on time. Got it. I got that part. But I have a lot of parents who have conscientious kids who do the best they can every day and work hard. And they've done this all through school. They worked really, really hard. So have their parents. Yeah, okay, got that. But, you know, all these kids that have to spend an hour every night, 2 hours every night, just to stay on top of schooling, it's not uncommon. They're hard workers. It's not like they don't deserve the supports that they do receive. And it is unfortunate that the reality of what Monika's saying, where, you know, kids don't get the supports they need, or they don't get them for 5 years. It's very unfortunate. I mean, as parents, all we want is for our children to do the best that they can do. That's all. And all we expect is some respect in the process and some supports. Not the moon and the stars. And, you know, it's interesting for me. I spent, you know, years, decades, traveling around the province doing seminars in different places, all over the place. And the way I would explain the situation to the parents attending these seminars is that maybe you've heard this example, that if you put the supporting professionals, which includes me and Monika, if you put the supporting professionals and the doctors and the support workers and social workers and teachers and all those in the context of the family and the child, and if you put that into the context of an egg and bacon breakfast, you know, the chicken's involved but the pig's committed, and it's just a given as far as I'm concerned. The parents, you know, they're the advocates and the daily heroes for their kids all of their lives, and the only real thing that affects them, the thing in the back of their mind all the time, is what will happen to my child when I'm gone. I just want to live one day longer than my daughter. And I've had situations like that. It's always very sad, but we have had those situations. And this is what we try to address in our estates practices, arrangements with instant trust provisions and, you know, RDSPs and so on. A common question we've found is, should I have an RESP or an RDSP? And my usual advice is that you set up both if you wish. An RESP, can't go wrong. You own it, you can always have the money back. There are minor repercussions to withdrawing it, that's true. But that's just as to the grant portion and the income portion. It's no big deal. And there are ways to roll those sums over if it's worth the trouble to an RRSP or to an RDSP. It's generally not worth the trouble, just because what you do is if you find the child's not going to use the RESP, and you withdraw the money, and then use it to make the annual payments into the RDSP over time to get the grants and bonds. So it's pretty simple. And as far as the RESP is concerned, the terms around RESPs are very flexible. You can maintain them up until the child's 35. The time criteria and the program criteria for a qualifying post-secondary program of some sort is very flexible. You could go to Algonquin College with 10 of your friends with similar children and have them fashion a program for those kids. I've seen it done. And that's a post-secondary program, right? It's just, I think the one was horseback riding. Why not, right? Sometimes it just takes kids a little longer to learn some of the skills that they need. So I've found this very fascinating. I mean, we've never touched in the detail that Monika has provided on this topic. But I know from practical experience that we often start out working with a family from when the time the child is very young. I remember a great guy up in Sudbury, he's a lift operator, and he had a daughter, and I did a presentation to the Sudbury Bar Association some years ago in October, and I did a presentation of the Children's Hospital at the same time. They had a brand new Children's Hospital, and so I did this presentation, and this fella showed up, great guy, and he had a daughter, a young daughter, and he had recently had a son born that August with Down syndrome. And That child had heart surgery in the next months. Took about a year for this to take place. Had heart surgery, fixed his heart defect, had 2 cochlear implants. And, you know, we proceeded with their wills and Henson trusts and so on. And, but what I find in general is that families with kids with special needs, they just don't have enough time. There's too much coming at them until the child is like age 7 and in school, and they've got some of these things stabilized for them to lift their heads up from the ground and, you know, address the more distant horizon things that we discussed, you know. And similarly, when clients, you know, they've made an appointment, generally on the phone, but sometimes in person. My clientele across the province, about 90% of them never see the office. But, you know, when they have to cancel an appointment, it's not because they've just blown me off. That's not how it works. What it is that something has come up with their child. That's just how it is. I know that. And, you know, I was talking to a mom the other day, and she's been in touch with the office, on our lists, taking part in webcasts. She's in Stratford, and she's been doing this since October of 2002. And now they're going to proceed with things. And that's not uncommon, not at all uncommon. I remember a client who came to see me a short while back, and he happened to drive from Sudbury. It's about a 5-hour drive. One of the virtues of this practice is that, especially in today's coronavirus world, is that our practice is remote, right? It's a convenience for our clients. They don't have to come and see us. So, you know, we deal with clients remotely in Kappas Casing, for example. They don't have to drive to Toronto to get things done. But they came to the office, and 10 years before, they had been at a seminar I had done in Sudbury, and they had the original handout paper. It's not like they'd forgotten. It's just they hadn't got around to it yet. And then finally, you know, something had motivated them, time had freed up, something. Maybe their parents had died. And then they proceeded. This is very common. So it's a very interesting practice. It's a lifespan practice where we start when the kids are young and just carry right on until the parents die. And then we set up we do probate, and we set up the trust and advise the siblings who are the trustees about how to do it. You know, it's a full spectrum lifespan practices, which is very gratifying. You know, you get to touch base with your clients, you know, 7 years later. And it's a very, very interesting practice. And the process, hopefully, in the meantime, you've learned a couple things and maybe tell them something new. We've had a variety of questions. I've answered a few. And I'm just looking at the last ones here. I want to know if my RIF and TFSA investments should have my child as the beneficiary or not, with the will already having Henson trust provisions. No, if you designate them to the child, firstly, the RIF will be received in its entirety, every dollar, by the child, unless they have cognitive impairments, in which case, a lot of times they couldn't manage the RIF. It won't roll over unless they have a cognitive impairment and they're dependent, unless they could, of course, put it into an RDSP. But this again gives them the asset. And so there's the issue of, well, what will happen to that asset? And will it disqualify them from ODSP? So there's that issue for them. So no, if you have a designatable asset like a TFSA, and your plan, you know, if your spouse has predeceased you, is to include that TFSA in the Henson Trust, then you would designate it to the trustee, or just to your estate on the basis that the estate's going to be divided. But these days, you know, there's more and more estates where there really is only one child. Youth who have a traumatic brain injury qualify for all these just as developmental disabilities. Well, if you have an acquired brain injury, it may well affect your cognitive abilities. Certainly, if it's a frontal lobe injury, it could well affect your emotional ability. So it would be a question. Where'd they go? Okay, but it's not a developmental disability. It could be a cognitive impairment. That could be. If you are eligible for the disability credit, would you qualify for passport funding? No, that's not it. If you are someone who is approved for the disability tax credit on the basis of a cognitive impairment, well then yes, you'd qualify for DSO and you would qualify for passport. My son was in after-school daycare. He turned 14 this past year, and the daycare stated that they could not provide after-school care for him because of his age. Although he is 14, he functions at the age of 6 or 7. Interesting. Because he is not able to be at home alone, and I cannot afford a nanny, what can I do? That's a good question, Monika.
Mm-hmm.
Is it based upon the functional age or chronological age?
Generally, the daycares are based on chronological age. I would address this with the daycare staff. The only time that this is a concern is in the physical stature of the child. So if the child is towering above the other children in that, I think it's the maximum age is age 12 for after school care. And so if the child is very large and looks 14 or 15, then they can say that, I don't actually know what reason they would find. They always find a reason though. But I think that would be something to discuss with the care providing service. If it's a school-based service where this childcare service is in the school facility, they may tend to take them. I haven't actually come across this situation before.
It's interesting. I mean,
So that is an interesting question.
In my experience, just as a general rule, all these frontline people, you know, they have the authority, they think, to say no.
Yes.
Right? They may, perhaps, have the authority to say yes. But of course, if you say yes, and in all the other cases, it's been a no, well, you're sticking your neck out, right?
Yeah.
Right? So, but it's entirely possible. I mean, happens all the time with us that, you know, you're dealing with somebody, a bank officer or I don't know, an ODSP staff person, and we know the rules, and so we tell them what we want them to do, and they, you know, they're confused. They've never done it. They don't think you can do it. Even if you can do it, they just don't think it's right. You know, so you know, you've got all these frontline people who think it's their job to say no, you know, and that they're somehow maintaining, you know, the balance of life by saying no to people. So, you know, I would never take, you know, no for an answer to start with, but and
Yeah.
most likely these parents won't either.
Yeah, I would suggest that. I always tell the parents, and they often, I'm often told that they say that they are told that, oh, well, this is our policy. And I said, if it's a policy, ask them for a copy of it. Because if it's in writing, then it's based on maybe an old piece of legislation that is not compliant with AODA or the Ontario Human Rights Code anymore.
Sure.
The most readily reached for excuse in the schooling environment when it comes to daycare or anything or excluding children is safety. So going back to the example, if this 14-year-old is a very large child and has a lot of strength, then they would likely use the issue of, well, it's for the safety of the other children or
Exactly.
something to that effect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's exactly. Make their job easier.
Yes, it's always about administrative convenience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you know, I mean, the people we're dealing with are just human, fallible, sometimes malicious, sometimes stupid, but otherwise, you know, if you want to be charitable, you know, just human, fallible people just like us, and you know, they're subject to the same foibles that we are. Like when we have situations where a parent, the bigger part of my estate work is all the people who aren't my clients when they die. And then they die, and there's some money being put forward by one of the, you know, their will for a child with disabilities. So I'm contacted by somebody, the executor or a sibling, or maybe the person themselves from time to time. And they're concerned that they'll lose ODSP benefits. And, you then go through this process of advising them, what can be done and how to protect the money and how to not lose benefits and all these things. And then in due course, you do a disclosure to ODSP. And it may well be that the ODSP person has never dealt with this before. And we've had situations where it's just simply obvious that they're jealous. This child with cognitive disabilities or mental health issues or whatever it is, their parent has died, they owned a home in North York, there are 3 of them, they're each getting 300 grand. And that worker doesn't have 300 grand. And they don't have a home in North York, right? Because they're in Sudbury. And I find it's mostly the small towns like Guelph, sometimes Simcoe, they're not that bad. Brockville, you'd think that Brockville's a fair size, but it's the smaller towns that have these little tin pot dictators that, their first knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh no, and they send out a computerized letter. Your benefits are suspended until further financial information is provided to the person in the group home. Anyway, I got to stop. Let's see here. So I'm still wondering if epilepsy is a medical need eligible for support in schools. I would think that if when they're in their home environment, they have to have a safe place, with padded edges to have a seizure, then it would have to be something that would be considered. I mean, look at all the people that have brain injuries from epilepsy, right?
Yeah, so it's a medical condition and it does definitely have a safety need in the school setting. So there is a new protocol in schools that's called a plan of care, or POC. And when a parent discloses a medical condition, there needs to be a file on that in the school office, similar to the EpiPens and all of the allergy, other conditions. And it has to be known what the protocol is if this child has an epileptic seizure at school. So it wouldn't entitle the student to a personal attendant kind of EA in terms of support, but there definitely needs to be a communication and action protocol in place, documented.
Monika, there's a woman, Erin, who is asking several questions, and she's asked previous questions. Erin, I think you should contact Monika directly. Your questions are a little too detailed. I'll pass you to there's her contact details. The good question here, if my RIF is designated to my child's RDSP, is that an option? And if so, would taxes be due as soon as I pass away? So that's not really how it works. What happens is you have to designate the RIF, the RRSP, to the child, and then the child makes an election to have it received and transferred to the RDSP. So it's an election process, just as it would be if it was to a spouse. And it would roll over if the paperwork is done. There's two packages, 2 sets of paperwork. And you then get into the question of, well, firstly, it's got to be less than 170,000, but that's fine. The child has to be less than 59. I've had situations, a couple of them, one recently, where the child is 56 in this particular recent case, and there's a RIF that could flow over like this, but of course the dad has to die before the kid's 59. After the kid's 59, it's too late. Dad dies then, it can't go in. But if we're talking at a younger age, which I hope we're not, then you designate it to the child, and this then gets you into the question of, well, are they competent to do this? Can they send a power of attorney? Do they have a legal representative? Do we have to have a legal guardian in place to do this? so that you don't wind up paying tax on 170,000 RIF? Well, yes, you would if that was a scenario. Let's see. I think this will be the last one. Dawn asks, my son was kicked out of daycare when he could not walk at a certain age. He was too old to remain in the baby section, but he could not walk, so he was not allowed in the older section. I had to find home daycare at my son's expense. The beginning of a lifetime of segregation. Well, yeah, you're right about that. That's very interesting. Could not walk at a certain age. What do you think about that?
I think that would be a human rights violation.
Yeah.
Because again, it's similar to that the students are placed in chronological age. I'm just waiting for a parent to take into human rights tribunal because of age discrimination and what makes it necessary for a child to follow their chronological age cohort when they're not developmentally there.
Yeah.
Yes. So this daycare, yeah, definitely that's something that you could take to the ombudsman. I don't know if it was a private or a public daycare.
That the same person, Don, this child is obviously a high needs child. My son has types of epileptic activity all day long, not just convulsive. His plan of care describes a response to a convulsive seizure. He requires supervision and support throughout the day at home to help with regional seizures affecting certain muscles or balance or speech and absence seizures. Absence seizures are very common. But the plan of care would be to help him throughout the day as I or his siblings do at home. The school is not responsive. Well, I don't know. The high needs child, do you think they just, don't want to apply supports, or what's going on?
I don't think that they realize the level of safety risk that this child has. So this is definitely something that you need to speak to a superintendent about if the principal is not understanding this. So this would definitely qualify for EA support. It's a medical need, especially if the epileptic activity is regular and daily. That's a medical EA.
Yeah, it's hard, hard to underestimate the. I'm not going to describe it. It's hard to underestimate the situation sometimes because remember some years ago, a young boy was born, and the mother was told that he would never be able to roll over. And by the time he was in grade 2 or 3, he was age functional in every way except that his right hand was still weak and he needed a slant board. And a father who had made a slant board, a wooden slant board, for his daughter had given this slant board to my client mom. And he was in a Montessori school. The grandmother was paying for this. And through dint of extreme hard work on the part of the boy and the mom and the grandmother, he was normal, in every way, except this one hand was still weak. And really what he needed was a laptop. He could type because he didn't have to hold a pen and a pencil, I guess. And personally, the school couldn't get it together to have somebody carry that slant board for him from class to class. I don't get that bit. Here you are paying tuition and they can't figure out how to have somebody take the slant board from class to class for you. And they wouldn't let him have a laptop because nobody else had a laptop. Right? It's hard to underestimate this lack of getting it. I'm going to shut up. What else we got here? I think that's about it. We've had a lot of good questions. We've answered quite a few. We've answered 18. from what I can see. You're welcome to contact my office. The way to do that, if you have questions, is email Karen, K-A-R-E-N, at kpopelaw.ca, and she'll collect the information. She'll advise me. She'll set up a consult if appropriate. And as far as Monika, of course, there's her consultation, her communication details. It's 8:25. I think that's good. We try to have these run from 7 till 8. There's 41 still in attendance. We topped down at 62, and I'm hopeful that for those who have stayed and taken part, that this has been helpful. And look forward to next month. Next month is legal guardianship again. We have a few topics we do each year, and we have people that attend multiple times often. So the next topic for April will be legal guardianship and powers of attorney. For example, there was a question here just a moment ago about a fellow who says, you know, if my son receives half of my teacher's pension, which is entirely possible, teachers, OMERS, OPG, the child with special needs as an adult may well be able to receive half of the pension. And for a teacher, if the pension is 60,000, which wouldn't be unusual, then the child would get 30,000 of that. And the answer to the question that you posed was yes, they would then lose ODSP. And also you get into the competence question of are they competent themselves to apply for this pension? And if they're not, who's going to do it? Who's going to apply? Who's going to manage the payments? Because the payments will be issued directly to the child. Same as our RDSPs. When the child eventually starts to receive the payments from the RDSPs, they're made payable directly to the child, the beneficiary. Well, if they're in a group home and they're not competent, who's going to manage this for them? So that'll be what the topic next month is all about. And that said, thank you very much. Thank you for taking part. And I'm going to stop the share now and speak to you next month.
Thank you very much. Good
Okay.
night.
Take care.
Take care.